Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Disclosure Project. Tonight, you find yourself in the vast, silent expanse of the New Mexico desert, summer of 1947. The air hangs heavy and still, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage. It's a land where time moves slowly, and the stars at night feel close enough to touch. Here, a quiet rancher named Mac Brazel, going about his solitary work on the Foster Ranch, came across something profoundly out of place. Strewn across the sun-baked earth was a debris field unlike anything he or anyone else had ever seen. Metallic fragments that defied bending, foil that refused to crumple despite its thinness, and strange, unidentifiable symbols etched into beams. Imagine his hand, calloused from years of ranch work, picking up a piece that felt weightless, yet impossibly strong. This was not the wreckage of any known craft. It carried the unsettling impression of something alien, something that had descended from that impossibly close sky, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. The desert at night is rarely silent. Cicadas shape the darkness with their droning pulse, a background chorus that never changes pitch, never loses rhythm. From further off comes the wavering call of coyotes working their way along dry creek beds, their voices echoing where the stone holds the sound. Even the wind has its familiar tone, brushing past the sage in low whispers that stretch for miles. This was the soundscape of rural New Mexico in 1947, steady and unchanged. A pattern of noises any rancher could read as easily as a clock. To those who lived it, the music of the night was dependable, almost comforting in its predictability. But on a July evening, that dependable rhythm broke. It began as a tearing sound, sudden and violent, spreading through the desert as though the horizon itself had cracked wide open. Those who heard it described not volume but force, the way the sound landed in the chest first, ribs vibrating before the ears registered it. It carried a raw quality, like a giant hand pulling apart corrugated tin with no hesitation, except stretched across the horizon, magnified by the vast emptiness of the plains. It wasn't thunder. Every farmer knew the way electricity sings before lightning cracks. It wasn't the shuddering rumble of artillery that sometimes drifted faintly from the base at Roswell. And it wasn't the whip crack of an aircraft going supersonic. The desert knew these sounds all too well. This was none of them. But before we continue, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press of the like button goes a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, back to tonight's story. Across the stars, a pale streak burned into visibility, white against infinite black, moving neither like a meteor nor like a machine. Meteors flash quick, bleeding orange against the horizon before death swallows them. Aircraft cut straight lanes, steady in their glide. This light stretched longer than either, glowing too bright, then breaking apart yet still holding a sense of direction, as if guided instead of falling blind. Witnesses later said it lasted only seconds before the desert took it back, but seconds were enough. A glow that strong paints itself permanently on memory. Then there was the quiet, the kind that hangs thicker than any noise, pressing into the ears until the absence itself feels heavy. Silence of this weight isn't truly empty, it's crowded with questions. Night birds withheld their calls, coyotes hushed their hunting songs, insects that thrive on endless chirps fell mute, waiting out something they could not name. The desert can be harsh, but it rarely pretends to be lifeless. Yet in the moments after the tearing sound, it played dead, a stage never repopulated by the usual cast. The stillness continued. Seconds, then long minutes, each breath of air an anticipation that never landed. Out there, nothing resumed its script. For those awake, tension rippled under the skin. The sound had suggested distance, yet it felt close. It had covered miles, yet nested inside their bones. Some later said it seemed as if the very dome of the sky had been ripped, forcing a vibration that tumbled down to earth. That was the unsettling part. The sense not simply that something fell, but that the world itself shifted its alignment. People in 1947 were closer to the landscape than later generations. A rancher didn't own radios in every room, but he knew how pressure shifted before rain. He read the moods of birds, the wander of cattle, the hue in the air when storms approached. Those old ways told him patterns, and once a pattern acquainted itself, anything strange became clear. The tearing was too strange to map. Even after midnight wore on, the absence clung stubbornly to the desert. Stars churned overhead with no haze softening them. The moon showed crisp lines, bright edges, but offered no hint of what crossed earlier. The silence rarely relented, a valley locked in anticipation, a chorus permanently caught before the downbeat. It wasn't only human nerves reacting. Horses refused to settle fully and kicked thunder into wooden rails. Dogs paced. Cattle moved away from their traditional grazing ground, steering toward unnatural clusters farther from the event's epicenter. Something had fractured the balance between sound, space, and instinct. Some whisper the sound stretched farther than Roswell, that it spilled south into the parched brush of Corona or out toward the mesas beyond. Distance there is deceptive. The flat earth carries a long message, and an unnatural vibration might cross dozens of miles. Those same witnesses claim they felt it not in their ears but their backbone, like an invisible tremor. Nobody brought apparatus to measure decibels or shockwaves, but memory lingers when an entire night of creatures falls mute together. Unlike papers or photographs, this testimony couldn't be swapped. It survived in recollections that said nothing on Earth explained the resonance. The desert, for all its stillness, is old. Humans lived there by learning seasonal rhythms, studying animals that spotted danger before they did, or reading cloud patterns promising water. Against that background, something tearing through the sky felt like breach more than event. It wasn't a story to be told that night. It was an alarm laid in the land. For ranchers waking suddenly, heart pounding against an inexplicable collision of sound and then fresh emptiness. It was as though the world outside their door had blinked for a moment. You can ignore a strange gust of wind or an animal's sudden spook. But when everything stops together, the mind starts searching for reason. That July night ended without answer. Ranchers lay awake replaying what their bodies had registered without consent. The noise and the quiet that followed tangled together until they seemed inseparable. Memory wired them into a single impression. A wound cut into the sky, followed by a desert holding its breath under the stars. What the Earth would show in daylight had not yet arrived, but already minds were primed for an exception to reality. And from the landscapes outside ranch houses, from corral to canyon, still air waited, preparing to unveil the strange material evidence that would scatter across the sands by morning. The morning sun already carried weight. Heat shimmered above the scrub and danced across the wide grazing lands, distorting distant fence posts into wavering columns. Mac Brazel rode out as he had countless times before, reins loose in his hand, eyes scanning the spread of sage and mesquite for straying cattle. The air was dry, the kind of dryness that cracks lips and draws sweat quickly from skin. Yet on this ride he noticed something unfamiliar. A faint metallic tang carried in the breeze, sharper than dust, stranger than rain scent. It didn't belong in rangeland air. That odd taste in his mouth was the first small signal that something unusual waited ahead. As the horse worked up a gentle slope, Brazel's eyes caught splinters of reflected light ahead. At first it seemed like an abandoned car door or stray trash glinting under the sun, but as he drew closer the anomaly stretched further, across a quarter-mile of hardpan. The ground wasn't marked deeply, no great crater like you might expect if a meteor had dropped from the heavens. Instead, a scatter of fragments sprawled across the earth, shining brighter than stone, duller than polished glass. To one raised in ranch life, Who knew every stump and jutting rock by rote? This constellation of glinting shards looked absurd, out of place, as though the land itself had been dressed in foreign cloth overnight. Mac dismounted slowly, boots grinding against gravel, curiosity drawing him toward the nearest object. At his feet lay a strip of material, thin and flexible, resembling foil peeled from a candy wrapper. He bent down, picked it up, and felt a chill pulse of surprise. It weighed nearly nothing. Between thick, calloused fingers, he wadded it into a small ball, expecting the quick crunch of crumpled foil. But when he opened his hand, the sheet sprang smooth again, unmarked, uncreased, as if the act of crushing had never occurred. He tested again. Same result. No fold lines remained, no wrinkles at all, only seamless return to its perfect flat form. He'd worked with wire, tin, barbed steel. Metals don't behave like cloth. The stubborn impossibility of the scrap froze him in place. Brazel walked further into the field, crouching now and then to test other pieces. Some displayed the same strange recovery, others carried a different mystery. He found beams no thicker than broom handles, yet startlingly light, even lighter than balsa wood. When pressed against a rock, the beam wouldn't splinter, wouldn't mark, wouldn't even dent. He tapped them together and felt solidity surpassing steel, though each stick seemed hollow. Near the grooves, faint carvings appeared, angular marks, geometric strokes that caught sun like mercury trickling across their sides. Not painted, not stamped, but sunken into the surface itself, natural as veins in stone. He brushed dirt from one and traced his fingertip along an etched figure. It didn't resemble letters he knew. More like hieroglyphs, though sharper, their shapes too deliberate to be accident. He felt material rather than craft, as if the beam had grown that way. The further he wandered, the stronger the strangeness pressed. Not only the objects themselves, but the absence of other life around him. Normally the plains clattered with insects, grasshoppers kicking up like dull fireworks, crickets chirping in shelter. Birds glided overhead in search of easy prey. This morning, silence curled across the land. His horse stood tethered some paces behind, ears flat, shifting uneasily, and even the cattle gave the zone-wide berth. The air held not only metallic taste but a hush of withdrawal. Nature seemed to recoil from this stretch, leaving the debris to rest untouched. It unsettled Brazel in a way cattle disease, storms, even bandits never had. He was a practical man, taught to mend fences, to read clouds, to see tracks in sand, and know which belonged to rabbit or coyote. Nothing in that life of routine prepared him to see metal act like cloth, wood act like tempered iron, or beams etched in alien script. Yet the fragments spread outward in undeniable proof before his eyes. His instinct argued it could be some military experiment, dropped from the sky by accident. He had heard of Japanese fire balloons during the war, carried thousands of miles across Pacific wind currents. He had also seen the remains of weather balloons, limp rubber snagged in brush, coils of wire tangled in dry branches. These objects bore no resemblance to such wreckage. The foil alone refuted all memory. No balloon left behind material that refused to crease, no plane built from beams so weightless a man could swing them like straw yet impossible to break. Brazel crouched again, lifted another strip and felt its strange surface, oddly cold despite the growing heat. The desert was quick to bake anything left under the sun, yet this piece stung with chill, as if pulled from shade or icebox, though neither stood within miles. He turned it in hand, squinted at its brightness under glare and shook his head. This was not scrap left by human machines. If the war years had taught him anything, it was the character of ordinary debris spread across New Mexico after military tests. This was nothing like that. Many veterans still recalled the burned rubber smell of balloon fabric. Others described twisted shrapnel from accident sites at bases, jagged aluminum, fuel-stinking wires, bolts slick with oil. Here, no bolts, no rivets, no lines to tether pieces one to another. Only seamless surfaces, strange symbols, memory metal, and emptiness. He paused, took off his hat, wiped sweat with wrist, then returned to his horse. From saddlebag he pulled a coil of rope. Unused as it was unnecessary to carry cattle home that morning, he shoved foil sheets inside, folding them tight only to see them stretch themselves flat once more. The bag rustled with unnatural memory yet stayed closed. He gathered a few beams, stacking them across the pommel of the saddle, their weight surprisingly negligible, like stacked reeds. Each piece he handled wound him deeper into private doubt. Collecting them felt like carrying back proof of sorcery, both frightening and necessary. Mac Brazel wasn't a fanciful man. He neither read pulp novels about rocket men, nor wasted evenings worrying about starborn visitors. But when silence pulls across desert, when cattle balk from crossing a line, when your hands crumple foil that refuses to obey, that practical armour cracks. He looked again across shimmering plain, where glints of debris still peppered the horizon, unreachable all at once. This field stretched too far, too wide. Gathering even a fraction of these fragments felt monumental, yet he knew he had to carry samples. Somebody in town, someone with science at base, or law at office, would demand to understand. If a storm had torn open the sky, or if military craft had come apart mid-air, there would be records, explanations, apologies. Yet he sensed instinctively that the discovery refused explanation of that simple sort. He cinched saddlebag straps, mounted up and turned horse toward ranch house. As sunlight ascended higher into pale sky, the fragments still glared like fallen stars on earth. His horse moved uneasily, hooves crunching grit louder than usual, each step accompanied by Brazel's own unspoken question. He wasn't sure whether to be excited or afraid, for both emotions tangled. In the end, his actions remained pragmatic. Carry what he could, share with the sheriff, see what government men might think. But deep inside, unease took root. A thought he couldn't shake. If this material was not of any design he knew, then its source might not be the nations of Earth. Along horizon line, heat shimmer-blurred movement, yet faint dust plumes betrayed figures. Vehicles, perhaps military, crossing high desert roads, trailing long pale clouds against sky. He watched them from a distance for a moment, then pressed boots gently to horse's sides, urging it forward faster toward Homestead. Behind him the field of impossible metal waited under full glare of sun, still and silent, as if desert itself guarded the mystery. And somewhere behind those plumes, men with uniforms and authority were pressing nearer to the place where a rancher's morning ride had stumbled into something far larger than stray cattle. Across the flat land surrounding Roswell in July of 1947, the town settled into its evening rhythm. Porch lights clicked on one by one, radios murmured dance tunes and wartime news reports that were already drifting into Cold War headlines. The desert itself seemed steady and predictable, and then, cutting across that dependable summer night, came an object bright enough to steal every eye skyward. Witnesses called it brighter than a meteor, yet with none of the downward rush one expects from falling rock. Instead, it moved with purpose, slower, a glowing body splitting in places but somehow holding its shape. Families stepped out into yards to watch. Some called neighbours on telephone lines shared over party circuits. Others stood silently, unwilling to name what they saw. The streak burned across the stars before veering down past the horizon, leaving behind a second silence more unsettling than the sound that had first torn the desert wide open. By dawn, the land beyond Roswell bore scars. Mac Brazel, a rancher as practical as the dust around him, rode his horse toward the edge of his pastures to check the herd. The cattle had kept their distance from one section of ground, circling nervously as if an invisible barrier kept them from advancing. He soon learned why. Before him stretched a gouge in the earth, almost impossible in the scale of its neatness. Blackened sand lined the wound, and smoke lifted in deliberate spirals as though reluctant to leave. The breeze carried the acrid bite of ozone, a sharpness rarely tasted outside thunderstorms or the discharge of heavy machines. But here it mingled strangely with the familiar earthbound scent of desert sage. His horse balked, ears flicking, hooves stamping, reluctant to step closer. Brazel had to circle wide. The reins tugged tight as if animal and rider were negotiating trust in territory neither recognised. The ground itself seemed alive with heat, but in an unsettling order. Not scattered and random like the scorch one might find after lightning, but radiant circles, perfect, geometric, precise. When Brazel crouched near the edge, he felt warmth rising in measured waves, the way a stove gives heat rather than a fire. Scattered among charred soil lay fragments of material glowing faintly, colours shifting like the edge of bioluminescent tide pools. A soft hum vibrated at the edge of hearing, low and even, so gentle it could almost be mistaken for the ringing in one's ears after gunfire. Yet there had been no explosion, no thunderclap. Only this crater patterned with intention, fragments continuing to give off light when by natural logic they ought to have cooled. Those who had studied meteors pointed to Arizona's Barringer crater, a colossal pit made by raw impact force, stone hurled outward and trees flattened in rippling directions. But what Brazel saw was not chaos born of collision. This was something closer to construction, pieces scattered but engineered, shapes that suggested assembly rather than accident. The fragments did not resemble melted stone. They looked shaped, cut, every edge hinting at purpose. If the desert had been wounded, it seemed more surgical than violent. That difference troubled him the more he stayed. When he stooped to pick one up, the contradiction deepened. A shard the size of a plate lay cool against his palm, though his skin sensed warmth around it. The texture was sleek, resistant to dent or scratch, yet when he pressed thumb to its surface it flexed slightly, springing back without crease. Nearby beams lay longer than fence planks, weightless in his hands and yet unyielding. He tried to snap one against the ground, only to find it bent and return to perfect alignment. Symbols stretched across the surface in fine grooves. They were not painted or stamped, but rather grown into the material itself, like veins in stone though sharper, deliberate, geometric. He brushed the grooves with a calloused fingertip and felt pattern as much as saw it. For years he had known the simple certainty of tools, rope, wood, and weather-worn steel. This defied all of it. Around him, nature seemed united in its retreat. Horses pawed and snorted at distance. Dogs tied nearer barked into the dawn before stopping abruptly, retreating with tails low. Even insects, often constant in desert heat, were gone. No ants crossed the earth. No flies buzzed. The absence was sharp enough to notice even while his eyes measured impossible scraps. It was as though every living thing had voted against approaching, leaving him unwillingly alone in a field now larger than his courage. If this had been a downed aircraft, Brazel expected bolts, panels, coils of wire, leaking fluids, shattered engines. The bare essentials of flight had long been familiar, warplanes passing overhead during the conflict. Here lay none of it. Surfaces were seamless, edges impossibly neat, as though forged whole rather than assembled. The beams bore no joints. The fragments gave no hint of glass, fabric or solder. And wherever his eye caught those nested symbols, he noticed them shift at the very edge of sight. Not changes he could confirm when looking directly, but movements hinted at through peripheral vision. He blinked, frowned, rubbed his eyes, only to have the sensation return. The rancher's mind, tested by years of practical necessity, faltered at the puzzle. Every rule he understood bent without breaking, leaving him with fragments that belonged nowhere. He thought briefly of military machines, secret tests, or aircraft from elsewhere in the world. but his bones rejected the possibility. This was not human work in the sense he knew it, and as he weighed each beam in his hands, even the idea of wreckage seemed too crude. These pieces hummed faintly, as though part of them lived. Still, routine asserted itself. He collected samples and dropped them into his saddlebags. As he rode the horse away, he felt the pieces press oddly against the leather. Their hum travelled through to his legs. They carried more weight than balance alone explained. The silence gathered again as he left, deeper than before, as if the desert itself had seen him take part in a bargain not clearly stated. His horse finally moved steady when the glow and heat faded behind. Far across the plain, new shapes appeared against rising sun. Dust clouds lifted where vehicles moved, larger than wagons, straight lines hinting of discipline. They were not ranchers checking stock or casual neighbours curious about fire. These approached in file, cutting paths across open ground, with engines that growled steady, official, determined. For now they were distant, small on the horizon, but their approach was steady. Soon what Brazel had gathered privately would no longer belong to one man walking cattle line. Forces greater than pasture boundaries were closing in, their arrival promising a story that would not end here in the quiet of dunes and sage. And though he could not know it, these new witnesses would carry his strange fragments from desert morning into history's loud company, turning what one rancher touched into a tale the world still weighs under starlight. The desert returned to its still air. Birds kept their distance. Only the circling smoke and faintly glowing shards suggested that something larger than meteor, stranger than aircraft, had scored the earth in that lonely night. And while the ground cooled in its measured circles, the rumour of official engines grew louder on the far horizon, threading steel and dust straight toward mystery. Mac Brazel rode back into Roswell carrying more than dust on his clothes. His saddlebag carried pieces of bright metal that behaved in ways no rancher could explain, but his face carried something heavier, the unsettled quiet of a man who had touched the impossible and now had to speak of it. The town looked as it always had. Streets trimmed with modest shops, a church steeple rising above rooftops, a cafe where the screen door slapped in rhythm with the day. Yet for Mac, every glance and every echo in that small town seemed strained by the weight pressing inside his saddlebag. The desert was not supposed to give up such things, and now he was the one burdened with showing proof. In Roswell, stories thickened the air quicker than summer heat. The barber's chair was usually the first stop for both haircuts and half-truths, where a simple retelling could drift into speculation before the scissors made their final snip. At the post office, voices carried as people sorted their envelopes, trading cattle prices one moment and desert lights the next. Fence lines became points of exchange, men leaning on rails as if measuring more than livestock, weighing the unusual in words spoken low and cautious. Mac found that with every telling, his story mutated in ways he hadn't given it. A neighbour swore that strange lights had crossed the horizon that same night, steady beams instead of streaks. A child claimed they heard a strange humming above their house, not like an aircraft, but more like wires straining with power. Even a shopkeeper added a detail. Their radio had buzzed with interference without warning, a good hour before locals reported the crash. The conversations grew less about cattle and rain, more about what else might fill the sky. Some dismissed it outright. Critics said it was leftover wreckage, war junk drifting on air currents, or at its most extraordinary, weather experiments launched by the military itself. Others found themselves restless at night, staring upwards with unease, not quite sure where to look, but unable to stop looking. Roswell, which usually turned in early with predictable rhythms, was beginning to feel charged with a new kind of energy, faint like static in dry air, but impossible to ignore. The era itself shaped these suspicions. It was 1947, 2 years after the world's first atomic bombs had flattened cities most Americans only knew from maps. A freshly minted Cold War had started to stretch its shadow. and people lived beneath stories of secret bases, untested aircraft, and new weapons whose limits had not yet been revealed. Rumours of experimental planes already filled newspapers, and Kenneth Arnold's report of saucer-like objects had made national news earlier that very summer. Against this backdrop, when Mac spoke of fragments that could not be dented and symbols pressed into strange beams, his words did not fall into empty air. They landed in a soil already seeded with suspicion of the government, curiosity about the skies, and dread about the Soviet Union. Townsfolk carried their doubts and their curiosities into their most ordinary spaces. In Roswell's diner, the spit of grease on the stove continued as always, but inside the booths, lines were drawn. Some tables buzzed with speculation, leaning close as voices dropped to conspiratorial tones. Other tables fell into uneasy silence, chiding one another to let the nonsense rest. A conversation could die simply because a man in uniform stepped inside for dinner, and laughter could falter in mid-breath when children asked too loudly about flying discs. Coffee went cold, words grew careful, and the room shifted as though everyone was treading on stones beneath shallow water, not knowing where solid ground might break. Soon, authorities appeared without needing to announce themselves. Military jeeps began tracing their way up and down dusty roads, parking outside unmarked buildings and at times pulling up near the ranch itself. Officers stepped into shops with casual chatter, but their presence changed the air all the same. To the ordinary eye, they were just soldiers on routine business. To Roswell's residents, they were a signal that the story was being lifted from fence-line whispers into the hands of larger forces. The line between neighbourly tale and national matter had been crossed without public announcement, and the town quietly shifted in response. From that point on, Roswell began to carry itself differently. Residents who once chuckled at mention of saucers started scanning the sky without smiling. Mothers hushed children when planes droned overhead, even when those planes looked ordinary. People began watching their words in public rooms, as if the sound of a story had grown risky. Radios that once droned with news were tuned more carefully, ears pricking for any fresh report. Even children adapted in their own way, playing invented games called spacemen in backyards with borrowed tin pans and imagined helmets. The lightness of play contrasted with the unease among their parents, yet together they revealed the strange way secrets spread, half in serious tension, half by children pretending to know more than they should. These small behaviours painted a larger picture. When ordinary life shifts its rhythm without official cause, when a simple crash story alters not what people know, but how they act, it signals that something larger is in motion. Roswell was no stranger to the military. The base outside town loomed heavily in daily life already. But this was different. The jeeps weren't training manoeuvres. The voices of officers weren't casual enough. And the silence that followed every question in the diner didn't feel shaped by politeness. It felt shaped by the kind of pressure no one liked to name. As these underground currents grew, reports and whispers reached back toward the base. Information circulated quietly but persistently, details carried in fragments, but consistent enough to invite attention from higher authority. Brazel's saddlebag no longer contained just odd pieces of metal. It had become the spark in a chain that was now too wide to stamp out by simple denial. Soon, men with clearer orders and more official purpose would step onto the stage, drawn to a story that had escaped small-town limits. This moment, fragile as dust and brief as a heartbeat, was the last time the matter still belonged to neighbours, friends, and whispered recollections. The balance was already tipping. Those who walked Roswell's streets felt a change in the air even before anyone wrote the orders. Something was about to come down from the base, something that could transform rumours about debris into an official mystery carried beyond New Mexico. And when it arrived, memory itself would be reshaped, not by the fragments in the desert, but by the weight of men trained to make certain stories vanish. A dust plume rolled across the horizon, rising in a slow curl against the unmoving desert sky. The sunlight poured down without pity, heating every stone, clinging to every surface until the air itself appeared to shimmer. A military jeep bumped over dry ground, its tyres grinding sand and stone, engine noise mixing with faint static from the radio bolted to the dash. In the driver's seat sat Major Jesse Marcel, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. Headquarters grew smaller in his rearview mirror, its shape swallowed by distance until only the endless plain stretched ahead. Each mile carried him further from the centred order of Roswell Army Airfield into the isolation of ranch land where secrets waited in silence. Marcel's clearance granted him a perspective few military men of the late 1940s held. His work with the 509th Bomb Group tied him directly to the global weight of atomic power. He was trusted with the kinds of details that could alter the course of nations. In the aftermath of the war, the 509th was the only bomber squadron equipped with nuclear weapons. Within their circle, intelligence no longer carried abstract meaning. Every signal and fragment had the potential to shift the balance of a world precariously at peace. Marcel carried the calm authority of a man who understood that weight. The assignment that led him along these uneven dirt routes was phrased simply: investigate a crash in the desert, report what is found. On the surface, it was routine, yet the urgency of the orders suggested something beyond standard procedure, something the chain of command wanted settled quickly and without confusion. As his jeep rattled forward, Marcel sorted through his ingrained checklist. Could it be Soviet technology smuggled across borders on air currents, or dropped deliberately as provocation? That possibility carried immediate concern, but the peculiar location seemed ill-suited to espionage of that sophistication. Next, his mind set upon experimental aircraft, America's own, or perhaps leftover prototypes, from missions that had never reached public record. Yet training allowed him to recognize unmistakable traits of such wreckage: propulsion pieces, fuel systems, radar equipment. Patterns emerged swiftly in crashes of human origin. Another thought persisted: remnants of German technology, fragments of the rocket programs the Allies frantically divided among themselves at the war's end. That, too, came with a logic his hands knew well. By the time dust rose thicker against the windshield, each explanation flickered and then dissolved in his steady review. He felt prepared for something strange, but he also knew preparation can dissolve in a second once sight replaces imagination. Mac Brazel waited near the ranch, the landscape filled with quiet expectation, his stance telling its own weathered story. He was a rancher before anything else, measured by work done under long sun rather than theoretical puzzles. When Marcel dismounted, Brazel's greeting lacked ceremony. His eyes returned often to the ground as though memory of what he discovered still pulled at him. In a tone steady but insistent, he remarked that whatever this wreckage marked, it ain't no plane. Marcel asked careful questions without showmanship, his voice trained by intelligence work into shapes stripped of opinion. They bent down together, fingers brushing fragments that glimmered with muted light. The officer's gloved hand lifted a thin sheet. At first glance it resembled material no different from kitchen foil, soft and pliant, but when pressed and crumpled, it unfolded instantly, restoring flawless smoothness without mark or crease. He crumpled harder. It responded again, untouched, as though memory itself lived in the substance. The pragmatic motions of a man cataloguing evidence gave way to a frown that settled deeper with each test. Beside him, Mac confirmed with tacit nods. This was the quality that had disturbed him most. The way known laws seemed absent here. Beyond the foil lay beams, slight as wood strips, yet when Marcel squeezed, they refused to bend or snap. Symbols lined their surfaces, not raised nor painted, but embedded as though grown within the grain of whatever material this was. Faint geometric curves hinted at language or code, though unlike any carving he knew. He weighed one beam, surprise sharpening when its mass felt almost non-existent. lighter than any design of human industry and yet firm as steel in strength. That contradiction cut more deeply into his trained reason than any coloured story could. Inside Marcel, reasoning fought against recognition. He rehearsed cataloguing habits meant for aerial reconnaissance and field intelligence, described texture, note weight, record identifying numbers or manufacturer's marks. Yet each entry presented voids rather than conclusions. Where rivets should hold, there were none. Where wires should stretch, only smoothness lay. Each touch handed him impossibilities, and his training, meant to ground speculation in reality, found thinner and thinner soil to stand on. Still he worked with soldierly efficiency, refusing to freeze amid astonishment. Boxes were carried from the jeep, open flaps receiving fragments collected across the field. He labelled each with calm strokes, noted coordinates, traced placement with care, sheets stacked neatly beside beams, small shards wrapped in cloth to prevent unintentional breakage. Even as every piece seemed indestructible, he followed procedure. Nothing about classification excused discarding discipline. Mac Brazel assisted quietly, his saddlebags emptied piece by piece, each deposit dropping with faint vibrations that spread subtle tremors across the wooden boxes. Marcel noticed once that a compass needle at his hip shifted slightly when brought near, wavering as though tested by unseen current. He closed the observation in his mind, continuing without comment, though the detail etched itself deeper than many others would. Hours later, the jeep returned along the same dusty route it had travelled outward. In one sense, it was simply another night of field collection, evidence prepared for secure handling. Yet inside the trailing voices of his mind, Marcel recognised the unbridgeable gap forming. The report he would soon write could never replicate what his hands had touched. He paused near his modest house before returning to base, breaking silent habits by carrying one box in to show his family. This pause betrayed something unusual, a crack in the discipline that had guided each act of his career. His son, Jesse Jr., small compared to the weight of everything that box implied, reached for a fragment. Between delicate fingers, it looked like nothing more than lightweight metal, but the boy grinned, calling it magic, infusing it with wonder unsuited for stiff language. In that moment, Marcel faced a contrast more vivid than comparative measurements. The certainty of a child declaring marvel against the caution of an officer who could not name what he saw. To him, the rules of classification spelled secrecy and denial. To his son, the fragment spoke of endless possibilities. When the house quieted again, Marcel set the box aside, prepared uniform pieces for official transport, and sat with paper waiting beneath the tip of his pen. He needed to record dimensions, list materials, compile assessments aligned with intelligence requirements. Yet nowhere in expected vocabulary lay space for substance that resisted crease, for beams inscribed with unearthly glyphs, for fragments that weighed less than they should. The lamp at his table threw one corner into light, the rest into shadow, and in that uneven frame he grasped the truth only half concealed. The words he would write could never hold the reality pressed within those boxes. Through decades, Marcel would repeat his convictions shaped at that desk, recalling that what he handled was not explained by Earth's industry. He described beams bearing hieroglyphic symbols, a choice of phrase meant to anchor the unfamiliar in a known reference, yet implying origins far removed from local circumstance. Critics dismissed his claims as misremembered details or exaggerated memory, but he maintained they were formed not in imagination, but in the clarity of his trained senses at work. His later remark resounded quietly in interviews. "It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of." Whether assessment, confession, or testimony, those words carried the unshaking weight of a man who once trained eyes on world-ending aircraft, and yet found greater astonishment in light fragments scattered on a ranch. Some whisper that the military's swiftness in retrieving these samples reflected more than caution, It reflected doctrine built during the Manhattan Project, emphasizing silence and division of knowledge. Others counter that explanations can be contained in classified balloon projects, pieces of hardware misunderstood outside secret contexts. Each perspective adds shape to a puzzle with center missing, fragments shifting as new hands turn them. Yet in every version, the memory of Marcel stands anchored. A jeep in desert heat, boxes marked with ink, a steady intelligence officer whose expertise met its limit in a field of shining debris. By dawn, the official record would begin to bend. Press statements awaited, narratives adjusted for public sight, and the material he collected would vanish into the channels of classification. But this moment, before language overtook substance, has lingered longest. An officer trusted with nuclear secrets standing silent in his study, staring at a document he knew could never equal the touch of impossible metal he had carried in his hands. And in that gap between experience and record, the modern echo of Roswell would find its voice. Even now the story rests on that table lamp's cast light, one half bright, the other half shadowed. A moment where certainty wore two faces, one obedient and technical, the other awed and wondering. From that division would grow the myth, the arguments, and the questions still walking beside us when headlights cross lonely ranch roads in the desert dark. And what Marcel could not resolve in writing, the world continues to carry as unanswered story. The airfield settled into night the way a campfire dies down. A few coyote calls drifted in from the desert plains, their cries echoing off hangar walls before fading into quiet. Metal groaned as it cooled, a sharp click here and there when it shifted against its bolts. Duty lights cast small amber pools across the walkways, leaving the rest of the base in shadow. It seemed the entire installation had exhaled and chosen to hold its breath. Two figures crossed the stillness, each carrying heavy boxes with deliberate care. Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett moved toward a dimly lit office at the edge of the hangar, the desert night pressing against their shoulders as heavily as the crates did. Inside, the room offered little comfort, only a desk lamp left on, a single cone of pale yellow catching dust motes that floated in lazy circles. The rest of the space lay in darkness, a kind of staged simplicity that made every small sound, each set of footsteps, each creak of wood, seem amplified. They placed the boxes on the table without a word. For a moment, neither man moved, the stillness between them not hesitation, but recognition that what sat inside those containers might refuse to be explained by the frameworks they had relied on their entire careers. Marcel slit open the first box and lifted a fragment with gloved hands. A narrow beam, no larger than a yardstick, caught the lamplight. He turned it slowly, noting its sharp edges but feather-like weight. It seemed hollow without being fragile, harder than the best steel he had tested, yet light as balsa. His mind, trained in years of intelligence analysis, rebelled against the contradictions. He had logged German alloys brought back from Europe. He had examined Soviet prototypes tracked by reconnaissance reports. None had possessed these properties. Next came a sheet so thin it resembled paper, yet it resisted every test of force. Marcel tried, with measured effort, to crease it. The fold vanished the second he let go. He crumpled it into his palm only to watch it unfurl perfectly smooth in the lamplight. A dull shimmer played across its surface, catching and releasing little glints like water disturbed by a skipped stone. This was the so-called memory metal, and its behaviour mocked every textbook principle he had studied. He scratched at one corner with his blade. The edge dulled before the sheet even recorded a mark. Cavett leaned closer, his face stern, cautious. Trained in counterintelligence, his instinct was to file possible threats into recognisable categories. He suggested it might be an experimental composite, some classified project he hadn't been briefed on. Or, he speculated, a foreign power's covert technology, launched on a test that had veered terribly wrong. Marcel listened, but each theory strained. Where were the welds, the rivets, the seams of construction? Aside from strange grooves beneath the light, patterns like shallow hieroglyphs shaped into the beams, there was nothing to suggest conventional fabrication at all. The two men studied another fragment. Its surface looked faintly like snake skin, a scaled texture that shimmered slightly when tilted at angles. Marcel ran a gloved finger across it, expecting raised bumps. It felt smooth, as if the scales were only illusions baked into the material itself. Cavett glanced away, muttering something about optical tricks. Yet he offered no explanation for why a technology would require such illusions. Another piece appeared almost organic, more grown than forged. The officers exchanged looks but avoided words. Neither dared summon the obvious term that hovered above the desk like smoke. The atmosphere of the room settled heavier with each examination. Marcel catalogued weight, density, appearance, even drew quick sketches under the lamp. Cavett recorded measurements with slow precision, his pencil taps the only rhythm in the quiet. They worked not like soldiers following procedure, but like archaeologists opening a sarcophagus, half fearful that their intrusion disturbed something meant to stay sealed. Every repacked fragment carried the sense of adding to a puzzle whose picture no earthly frame could contain. It was not reverence in the religious sense, they were military men after all, but their movements grew gentler as the night passed. Every box was closed with deliberation, each ribbon of tape pressed against the seam as if the material inside might misunderstand rough handling. Marcel thought briefly of laboratory scenes he'd read about in reports. The first time uranium samples coughed up strange radiation at the University of Chicago, technicians holding glass vials and realizing their own bodies had just become part of something new. That same awareness now filled the silence here. When Cavett reached again for an explanation, he reverted to familiar ground. Could it be some classified test carried out without his unit's knowledge? Perhaps balloon components, modified with alloys to withstand the upper atmosphere? Yet the lack of tubing, of gauges, of instruments contradicted such a claim. Marcel said little but lifted another sheet, its flexibility bordering on absurd. He twisted it, tugged it, pressed his knife again against its edge. No cut appeared. It sprang back without scar. His training told him to report with certainty, but his mind catalogued impossibility after impossibility. Together they worked through the boxes in slow order. Hours crept on, marked only by the lamp's steady hum and the scratch of Cavett's pencil. They filled notes, yet the notes read more like questions than conclusions. What was the tensile strength of a material that erased its own bends? How did it achieve weightlessness while still proving unbreakable? Where did a culture learn to build without bolts, without seams, without leaving a trace of assembly? One fragment reverberated faintly in their palms, a subtle vibration almost too soft to register. Marcel held it longer, wondering whether it was generating or responding, whether the desert air itself pressed back against it. The sensation reminded him of his earlier flights through storm clouds, when static filled cockpits and turned dials untrustworthy. But unlike lightning, this fragment's hum carried no menace, only an unspoken assertion, "I am not from here." Still, neither man voiced the thought. They closed the last box, sealing tape across its lid with almost ceremonial slowness. Cavett stacked the files together, wiped the graphite smudge from one corner, and leaned back in his chair. The lamp showed his expression was uncharacteristically tight. Marcel stood for a long time before setting the final piece aside. Their eyes met once across the desk, a recognition without words. They both knew the ordinary categories of technology, domestic, foreign, experimental, had crumbled. What remained lay outside those grids. Marcel carried the files back under his arm when their session ended, releasing Cavett with little more than a nod. He stepped back into the desert air. The stars hung heavy above the base, brilliant in their clarity, undisturbed by aircraft or clouds. For the first time he looked upward and wondered in direct terms what lay behind those points of light. The weight of the crates he had left behind was nothing compared to that thought. The walk to his quarters was silent, his boots scuffing dust on the narrow path. The night smelled faintly of sage, but with an undercurrent of something sharper, almost metallic. He entered his room, closed the door, and set the files down without reading them again. Exhaustion might have let other men sleep. He felt only the pulse of possibility pressing behind his sternum. When he finally sat at the edge of his bed, the lamp dimmed low beside him. His hands rested on his knees as he replayed the night. The fragments that shifted under his touch seemed more real than his own surroundings. He had known classified material before, had watched secrets build scaffolds around the war that changed his generation. Yet this was something more destabilizing. It refused classification. It carried no national stamp. Its origin radiated elsewhere, and for the first time in his career he had no box to place it in. Outside his quarters, the desert stretched unchanged. Coyotes called again as if nothing had happened in the hangar hours earlier. And yet Marcel thought of the lamp's glow over materials that felt weightless and impossible. He thought of Cavett, quietly tallying measurements with a face that betrayed the same fracture in certainty. He looked out his window one last time at the rise of stars and felt an uninvited shiver that was part awe, part dread. Morning waited close behind, with press officers eager to frame narratives and phones already primed to ring. But for now the airfield remained still. For Major Jesse Marcel, alone with his thoughts, the night left behind a conclusion he would never be able to document fully. The objects he had studied did not come from any world he knew, and the secret now living in his memory would demand a lifetime of silence. And even in that quiet, the night whispered back, the story had only just begun. Typewriter keys clicked rhythmically in a cramped Roswell office, each metallic strike carrying more weight than the typist perhaps realized. Walter Hout leaned into the machine, the ribbon leaving dark words pressed onto white sheets with the certainty of official channels. The phrase that emerged quietly would move faster than horses or trains ever could. The many rumours regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday. Those words struck like flares across the desert sky, igniting curiosity far beyond the quiet town where they were forged. Hout stacked the finished pages neatly, the ink still damp, and passed them to waiting couriers. Soon, those sentences threaded into lines of Morse tapped urgently by radio operators, pulsing outward from switchboards thick with heat and static, slipping into the steady buzz of telegraph wires that link the country. In the early summer air, newsboys darted down Roswell's main street, voices carrying above the squeak of their bicycle chains as they shouted headlines impossible to ignore. Papers smelled of ink and oil, still warm from presses, as they landed into curious hands. In station offices, telephones rang in quick succession, operators plugging cords with tense efficiency as voices demanded confirmation. It spread as wildfire does in dry grass, swiftly, unstoppably, without pause for interpretation. Across states and into cities, a phrase leapt from page to ear. A disc had been captured, and the United States military announced it with confidence. The effect was instant and electric. In coffee shops and diners, conversation stilled as pages were smoothed flat against formica tables. Coffee sat untouched as neighbours leaned closer, breathless in the hum of the low voices asking the same questions. What does it mean? What did they actually find out there? Families gathered in rooms thick with midsummer heat, windows open to let in the faint smell of cut grass, radio sitting firmly in the centre of attention. Announcers' voices poured through the mesh of loudspeakers, clipped yet taut, repeating the headline with the same blend of disbelief and assurance. For 12 sharp hours, every ear bent toward the sky in a different way. For a moment, people did not wonder if something else might exist. They let themselves feel certain it did. The cultural mood of that summer had primed the ground for it. Only weeks earlier, Kenneth Arnold told of seeing 9 objects sweep across Mount Rainier's skies, their movement like saucers skipping atop water, giving rise to the new phrase flying saucer. Newspapers had fanned the imagery, illustrations sketching disc-shaped craft against blue horizons, and sightings suddenly poured in from across the country. Children found scraps of imagination in comic books where interplanetary visitors brandished ray guns, or in theatres where Buck Rogers carried them into other worlds frame by frame. Adults, no less receptive, lived under Cold War shadows heavy with secrecy, trusting and doubting at once. Into this charged landscape, Roswell's announcement felt less like disruption and more like confirmation of an idea that had already found them. At the heart of the discovery stood Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer whose career had borne secrets heavier than most men would ever carry. When the retraction came, photographs showed him posed obediently beside wood and foil pieces in General Ramey's office, labelled weather balloon components. His expression in print appeared obedient, nothing more than a soldier complying. But those who looked longer into his eyes in the flattened photograph noticed distance there, an incongruity that spoke louder than the neat arrangement of sticks and rubber before him. His hands had handled something different days earlier, material that returned to smoothness no matter how hard it bent, beams marked with textures folded into their core rather than carved. That knowledge could not be scrubbed away by camera flash. The retraction itself arrived with almost violent suddenness. Within a day of Haut's typewritten message circling the nation, Brigadier General Roger Ramey staged a press conference in Fort Worth. Reporters filled the room. The odour of sweat and cigarette smoke layered thick as he pointed to the mundane wooden crosses and dull strips splayed across the carpet. Beside him, the weather officer spoke in bland tones about radar targets used in dozens of stations, lifting pieces of material that looked hardly mysterious. The display was tidy, methodical, stripped of awe. Reporters scribbled dutiful notes, but the faces of many gave away unease. An announcement so confident hours earlier could not simply dissolve into balloon latex with credible ease. Even in Roswell's kitchens and parlours, confusion surged. Husbands folded papers more tightly at the dinner table, features drawn under the tension of choosing whether to accept the ordinary or to cling to what neighbours had already whispered. In small shops, owners cut front pages quickly, pressing them into files before they grew scarce, as though saving more than just paper. Children, with eyes wide from playground rumour, asked parents why last night they spoke of visitors beyond the sky, but tonight they were told everything was only a mistake. Parents hushed them, but the very act of silencing fed suspicion further. Enthusiasm's glow from morning cooled into unease by nightfall, the sudden shift creating a space large enough to hold decades of speculation. The public face of calm did not erase private fracture. One set of residents chose to accept the balloon explanation because it restored comfort, trimming awe into manageable order. Another set found themselves plagued by memory, of strange fragments in their hands, neighbours who spoke of unusual lights, cattle skittish in places they once grazed easily. For them, the balloon story rang hollow, as though pasted atop a painting without covering the original brushstrokes beneath. That divide, subtle in the moment, would deepen with years, leaving Roswell not just a town with a tale, but a microcosm of distrust between those who saw and those who obeyed. In the days after, silence did not grow naturally, but rather spread, as if cultivated. Questions posed in informal settings slipped away mid-sentence. Jokes that might have been attempted dripped into muteness when uniforms appeared through doorway frames. Where telephones once rang with friends inquiring about rumours, now wires carried fewer words, conversations cemented with sudden ends. The quiet sat heavier than any explanation in print, pressing down like the desert's mid-afternoon heat, unyielding and absolute. Roswell had become a town of partial truths, of things remembered but not spoken. The psychological weight of this abrupt transformation etched itself deeply. Some felt betrayed, others embarrassed, still others constrained by fear of reprisal. Yet what joined them all was an undeniable disorientation. The morning had promised a new vision of their place in the universe, and by evening they were told they had dreamed incorrectly. The mind does not accept such whiplash gracefully. And the gap between the two stories, flying disc and weather balloon, became larger than either artifact suggested, wide enough to house whispers, theories, and ultimately a mythology that would echo longer than anyone in that July office could have imagined. Think of Haut, pressing down typewriter keys with a sense of routine. His document was not fiery in tone nor wild in structure. It named facts plainly, even dryly. It was bureaucratic in style, official rather than poetic. Yet it ignited imaginations as efficiently as fiction. By the time counterparts in press rooms set fresh typeface, arranged in bold across sheets with the words RAAF captures flying saucer, a myth had already been released into the cultural bloodstream. No later correction could pull it back fully. For many in town, what lingered wasn't the words on broadsheets, but the way faces shifted. Housewives noting hardened lines on their husbands' brows, or teenagers catching the hush that swallowed adult conversations. Memory accumulated in small gestures, a man scattering crumbs on countertops while refusing another word. A child folded out of the discussion before curiosity could unravel the story. That collective muteness bound itself into daily life like plaster hardening over cracks, not erasing them, simply fixing them into place where everyone could see but few dared to acknowledge. The evening photographs remained, though, and with them an unquiet tension. The staged balloon arrangement read too carefully constructed for some, as if pieced together with performance in mind rather than raw immediacy. Critics countered that it was normal for military leaders to present conventional explanations in times of political sensitivity, shielding cutting-edge experiments from foreign eyes. Supporters suggested the items shown were substitute props, a neat display concealing what lay secured elsewhere. Each side argued from the same event, yet the wider they pulled, the stronger the story stretched. To watch Roswell in those days was to observe a town adjusting itself under pressure, not of climate, but of narrative. A single sheet of paper had brought the cosmic close. Another sheet erased it, commanding the extraordinary to return to the ordinary. The townsfolk lived between them, not quite believing either, and each silence only heightened the strangeness. The desert outside carried on, sun hammering, wind lifting dust spirals as though nothing had shifted. Yet beneath those everyday rhythms, something weightier stirred, the sense that the truth had been glimpsed then withdrawn, leaving a hollow more compelling than certainty ever could be. And so the town divided, not through open clashes but through quiet difference, between those anchored to what the newspaper declared and those anchored to what they themselves remembered, between wonder pressed flat by authority and wonder that refused to flatten at all. In such splits, myths grow, feeding not on answers but on the permanent gap between them. Roswell became less the site of one object's fall, and more the birthplace of a narrative no retraction could contain. The echoes of July 1947 would not end with Haut's press release, nor with Ramey's balloon display. They would linger in paused dinners, in clipped conversations, in eyes that carried weight unspoken. What began with typewriter keys and ink manifests would ripple long after, and the story, half seen, half hidden, would move outward like the summer radio waves that bore it, continuing across decades, still unsettled, still unresolved. Before dawn, the motor pool stirred without ceremony, tyres crackled against gravel, headlights turned low, and a dozen crates slid into unmarked vehicles with the quiet precision of routine. No shouting, no ceremony, just the work of men trained not to be noticed. Engines idled steady as weight shifted in canvas-shrouded bundles, their shapes uneven, some long beams, some smaller boxes that gave off no sound. The desert air was cool, still clinging to nighttime's chill, but within the base gates an uncharacteristic pressure lingered. Soldiers exchanged few words as tailgates slammed shut, their breath visible in the dim light. By the time the first streak of morning coloured the horizon, the objects were on the road, tyres hissing out toward highways that swallowed them whole. Disappearance in these circumstances seldom arrived in fire or destruction. It arrived through clerical order, numbered forms, checklists read aloud. Such was the working architecture of official forgetting. Files shifted from one cabinet to another, then quietly vanished when boxes left through rear hallways. Labels misapplied, signatures forged, or left intentionally blank, ensured that nothing appeared to have existed in the first place. The bland surface of paper acted as curtain, drawing across the strangeness like dust settling on old wood. This was bureaucracy doing what it did best, dulling sharp edges until nothing of consequence could cut through. For Major Jesse Marcel, the most jarring part was not watching crates disappear, but discovering how quickly the record of those crates vanished on paper. Hours earlier, he had logged careful notes, drawings of impossible bends in metal, impressions of etched grooves unlike any riveted plate he had ever seen. By morning, the folder bearing his name no longer matched what he had written. Neatly typed weather balloon reports filled the space with diagrams of sticks and foil, procedures familiar to any airman. His sketches, his handwritten notations, gone. The new documents read too clean, lacking the smudges of late-night analysis. Some whisper those pages had been destroyed entirely, replaced by fabrications that could withstand outside inspection. And yet for Marcel, memory kept the weight of what he touched, even when the files denied him. Around the base, patterns shifted. The sergeant who had carried boxes alongside Marcel found himself reassigned by week's end, transferred to a facility several states away with no warning, left to pack his single duffel and board a waiting plane. Others received desk postings that ignored their experience. Radar operators adjusting to new coordinates, clerks absorbed into minor payroll roles. It seemed whoever touched the material, spoken openly, or even lingered nearby found themselves scattering like the fragments themselves. Such moves echoed wartime tactics. During the Manhattan Project, entire teams had been relocated overnight, their new duties making silence easier than recollection. Empty rooms became their own evidence. The hangar where debris had been stored now rang hollow, shelves bare, lockboxes emptied. Men who had heard faint humming while standing beside the crates noticed only dust motes catching in light strips the following day. A storage ledger listed items received, but each line was scratched black by Sensor's pen, leaving only redaction lines drifting across the page like silent tracks. Empty air took the place of unexplained matter. In its absence, doubt grew sharper. Photographers in Roswell felt this pressure most keenly. One had hurriedly developed rolls after rushing to the site, frames of scattered fragments glowing faint in early sun. Within days, uniformed visitors stood at his doorway. They were courteous, their tone clipped but polite, invoking national security as they lifted negatives from his drying rack. His protest reached no ears. One look exchanged, and the film left inside folders clasped too firmly. Others learned to hand over images before word was asked. Studios felt the weight of empty drawers, shelves bare of glass plates. Town papers lost their chance to shape memory through image. Without photos, words could be nudged, dismissed, reshaped. The visual record fell silent, and silence suited officials well. In town itself, people noticed the shift not by what was said, but how words bent around newly sensitive air. Only weeks ago, diners carried lively retellings, light spotted in pasture skies, strange sheets that seemed alive beneath a rancher's hand. Now the same diners dropped their volume near strangers. Conversations trailed when uniforms opened the door. Men leaned closer across coffee cups, dropping to low tones, glancing over shoulders as if surveillance pressed against the window glass. Women hushed children who asked about discs in the air, guiding their curiosity towards safer reruns of cowboy shows on the radio. Speech learned to cut itself short. What lingered was not only uncertainty, but an atmosphere where trust began to erode. This choreography of silence recalled earlier chapters of American secrecy. During the Manhattan Project, hidden cities rose in the desert and in Tennessee hills. Entire towns fenced, mail censored, names vanished from directories. Families lived beside vast plants without knowledge of what they built, trained to think steadily of nothing. The culture of silence surrounding Roswell was smaller in scale, yet similar in design. Some residents may not have even recognised the echo, but those who lived through war's secret machines would have felt it familiar. The weight of living near something forbidden, unnamed yet undeniably present. By the close of the first week, the effort to normalise the story began to show through its seams. Weather balloons had drifted over New Mexico before. No one called the sheriff when latex scraps fell inside a fence. Yet men still remembered foil that crumpled back to smoothness, beams with etched designs no cattleman could attribute to aircraft. Every official assurance pressed harder at disbelief. The greater the insistence, the sharper the disquiet. It was the paradox of institutional control. The act of erasing evidence created an even stronger impression of what must have been there. Critics counter that this was simple Cold War discipline, designed to protect unrelated projects rather than extraordinary secrets. Supporters suggest the tight control masked far older truths, and so the desert carried both echoes, crates packed into convoy trucks under starlight, and voices lowered at cafe counters waiting for pie. What vanished from shelves and photographs did not vanish from minds. Like the afterring of metal struck too hard, it hung in the air, drifting without source but impossible to ignore. The official story placed its curtain firmly, foil and sticks, no stranger than experiments aloft in weather. Yet the gaps where memory faltered told something heavier. Rooms stripped bare, files too neat, families sitting quiet at supper tables. Silence itself became the artifact, arranged as carefully as any display. And in that silence, possibility kept a different kind of life. By the time convoys rolled east across state lines, the New Mexico desert already knew what would follow. Questions that could not be boxed, whispers spread thinner but never gone, and a story that refused to let the night close entirely around it. Cigarette smoke coiled lazily toward a low-ceiling fan that barely stirred the warm, stale air. In the conference room, long oak tables were spread with maps of Soviet territory and diagrams of classified aircraft. Ashtrays spilled over with half-burnt filters, matching the tired faces of men who had already fought one war and were preparing themselves for a new kind. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, an ordinary sound for an extraordinary meeting. No one raised a voice. The debate was not about what had come down near Roswell. The argument was about what it meant, and how the world should never know more than it was permitted. Each officer carried his own calculation. To them, debris was not broken metal. It was possible advantage, or it was possible threat. A single fragment, if understood, could alter balances they measured daily on maps and ledgers. One general tapped the butt of his cigarette hard against the ashtray as he explained his fear of panic. Opening the story to the public, he insisted, would invite hysteria. People in the streets might believe the skies no longer belonged to man, and order itself could sag under that weight. Yet across the table a colonel leaned forward, jaw set, arguing the other peril. He spoke of the Soviets, how their agents scoured for every scrap of knowledge, how any revelation would accelerate their progress. Within months, he suggested, what seemed like wonder could be weaponized. Panic or espionage, two hazards that shared a route. The story had to be managed. The officers spoke through scenarios like accountants of survival. They pictured headlines tumbling across world newspapers, shaking markets already nervous after the war. They thought of fragile political alliances that could crack under a rumour of foreign skies. Just as quickly, they imagined engines reworked by captured knowledge, satellites imagined before rockets ever climbed. Survival forced the mind into narrow lines. Protect advantage, deny the rival, secure the home front. These were not choices of liberation or deceit, but of preservation. To these men, every mystery became a calculation, not a wonder. During pauses, another kind of smoke seemed to drift through the room, the memory of older secrets. Several of the men had lived through Manhattan Project compartmentalization, watching as entire cities grew from desert nothingness, hidden from sight behind fences and silence. Others still carried files from Bletchley Park, where codebreakers laboured unseen to unravel enemy signals. Both examples had trained them in the same realist lesson. Extraordinary programs survive not through openness, but through walls of quiet. Roswell, to their method of thinking, required nothing new. It required only the renewal of what had already kept the most potent weapons in history hidden until the hour of their use. Out of this framework, the weather balloon became their instrument. Nobody in the room believed it perfect. Perfection was not the point. They needed a story as plain as cardboard, flat enough for the public to accept without thought, dull enough to pull curiosity away from brighter questions. Balloons had long drifted across deserts. Soldiers trained on them, farmers mended their fragments, children watched them from pastures. To say weather balloon was to say move along. The cover did not need beauty, it needed boredom. And boredom worked. As drafts of orders passed hand to hand, the lines of compartmentalization grew sharp. Witnesses from Roswell would be rotated through quiet rooms, separated from one another so stories would harden into isolation. Officers scribbled chains of custody, moving evidence from crate to crate so that no single man could hold an entire piece. Each directive shrank the circle tighter, need to know narrowing to narrower still. In the Cold War, secrecy itself was survival, and this moment was filed under the same rule as missiles, codes and bombs waiting in their bunkers. For all their certainty, hints of unease still surfaced. A major leaned back, stubbed out his cigarette and kept his gaze on the wall map without seeing it. He had heard of Marcel's family, of the boy who had touched a fragment at home and called it magic. That quiet image followed him, a child's hands handling what others now buried under files. He wondered, if only briefly, what kind of democracy demands silence even from children. He said nothing. He picked up another page and signed his name. With the last letters inked, the meeting ended not with shouts but with papers shuffled into folders. Telephones lifted from their cradles, voices moving outward to command staff, clerks, drivers. The plans seeped into the machinery of bureaucracy, a cover story already rolling down typewriter lines before the dust settled in Roswell's fields. Men extinguished cigarettes, pushed chairs back, and stepped into corridors where shadows lengthened against the walls. Inside, the hatch closed with a dull click. Silence floated heavier than the smoke. Behind locked cabinets, stamps pressed red ink onto manila folders. Classified, eyes only, restricted. The language of secrecy spoke with its own rhythm, stronger than debate, steadier than oath. Files would stack until cabinets required new rows. Yet in the pause after the meeting, even the officers knew they had sealed more than debris. They had closed away uncertainty, possibility and memory, things harder to contain than any Soviet advance. When the light in that room went dark, the story of Roswell split cleanly in two. An official history too ordinary to last, and an unofficial one that would only grow with every year of silence. Decades later, people would trace the echo of that meeting, as if following a shadow stretched across generations. What one desert town witnessed became a parable for how institutions guard themselves. The weather balloon was never really about balloons. It was about control, about the utility of boredom as armour. the way ordinary words hide extraordinary worries. Roswell's myth began not in a field of strange metal, but in this room of smoke, ashtrays, and tired men who measured the world by risk and survival. And so the locked file cabinets remained, holding back more than paper, holding back questions that would not stop with the close of a door. Outside that building, stars burned the same way they had before the crash, cold and indifferent. But for those who left the room that night, the sky would never look quite as it had. They had bound their decision in silence, and in doing so had ensured the story would never truly vanish. Instead, it would linger, half erased, half remembered, waiting to shape itself into the symbol it would soon become. Mac Brazel went back to his pasture weeks later, carrying the same routine that had always marked his days. But the land was not as he had left it. Cigarette butts lay crushed into soil that should have seen only tumbleweed and cattle hooves. Deep boot prints pressed into sand, where no neighbour or passerby would normally wander. Even without speaking, the ground seemed to tell him others had stood here during hours he had not been invited. Strangers had left their trace, and the land bore quiet witness to their visit. Brazel stared at the disturbed earth, his hat pulled low, and understood this place no longer belonged to him alone. When neighbours asked what he had really found, his voice sounded different. He no longer spoke with the easy tone of a rancher describing broken fence posts or stray cattle. Instead, he hesitated, muttered about being mistaken, and parroted back the official words he'd been told. The story that once carried certainty now came wrapped in apology. Yet anyone who looked into his face noticed something else. His words followed the script, but his eyes carried the weight of memory, as if he still pictured uncrumpled foil and beams marked with symbols that refused to match any tool on his ranch. The sheriff of Chavez County, George Wilcox, held his own burden. Residents trusted him to be the anchor of their town. They looked for assurance, for his calm judgment. But Wilcox was also receiving phone calls from men with polished voices and rigid authority. Each call pressed the same expectation: silence. He knew his loyalty was being pulled like rope in two directions, toward his neighbours who sought answers, and toward authorities who carried the power to make lives difficult if questions went too far. His silence became a form of survival, and in a way, loyalty to both sides. Say little, promise nothing, keep the balance unbroken. Animals remembered in their own fashion. Cattle still skirted the stretch of pasture where fragments had once lain. Hooves, steering wide as though an invisible boundary remained. Brazel's dog, once eager to follow into barns or outbuildings, now balked at the threshold where he had once kept samples. Its body stiffened, ears laid flat, refusing to cross the shadow line. Whether it was scent, instinct, or something no human could mark, the creatures recoiled from a place and an object long removed. Nature held memory with a kind of honesty no order could erase. In Roswell's diners and cafes, chatter dimmed whenever uniforms entered. A joke or story might hang on open air until the doorbell chimed above a booted soldier, and then the words collapsed. Coffee cooled untouched as newspapers folded in slow finality. Laughter retreated, eyes dropped to plates. The sudden quiet was its own signal, a performance of normalcy that no one believed. What had been called excitement only weeks earlier was now handled like contraband, kept under the tongue until the visitor left. The desert wind still swept down Main Street, but it carried a new weight. The same houses, the same storefronts looked curiously altered, as though painted with a thin film that made them slightly out of register. Routine carried on. Cars parked in front of grocers, mothers gathered at porches, school doors swung open, but a watchfulness clung to each motion. Residents tilted their eyes upward when a plane crossed overhead, lingering longer than before as if hoping to read some clue in the contrail. The rhythm of daily life had gained a new pulse of caution. People who had once leaned forward eagerly to compare accounts now turned away at the edge of the subject. A witness who had claimed to see strange lights found himself excusing his comment days later. A shopkeeper who once speculated openly about fragments now cut the thought short with a shake of the head. On sidewalks, neighbours who once traded stories began sidestepping those conversations, the avoidance itself unmistakable. Their silence carried more volume than earlier words. It was the silence of people choosing self-protection over truth. Children, untouched by caution, still whispered in schoolyards. Some repeated tales about flying discs, half remembered from dinner-table murmurs. But they were hushed quickly. Parents corrected them with sharp looks, voices lowered to urgent whispers. The warning in their tone made the subject glow brighter in imagination. Nothing captures a child's curiosity more than a forbidden word. The attempt to press the memory down gave the story deeper roots in young minds, roots that would grow across decades. The town carried on, yet a strange paradox grew. The harder people worked to act as if nothing had happened, the clearer the memory of the event became, not in words, not in open testimonies, but in what was missing. Silence lay over conversations like a second tablecloth. The absence itself became part of the town's memory, shaping its outline without ever naming its form. Forgetting had become a way of remembering. Roswell's quiet streets concealed a story not erased but driven deeper underground. It lived in sideways looks between old friends. It flickered in the pause before a sentence that changed direction. It marked itself in unfinished answers, in things spoken halfway before ending with a shrug. For those who had seen or heard, the memory rested in their posture and in their caution. Beneath the desert calm, seeds of withheld truth settled into soil, patient as any seed under sand, and like seeds, they waited, not destroyed, but hidden, ready to rise when the season of remembering came again. Canvas strained against rope as dawn approached, pulled tight over wooden truck beds with the slow certainty of practiced hands. There was no ceremony to the loading, just soldiers working in quiet rhythms, their boots crunching over gravel as they secured boxes whose lids gave a faint, steady vibration in the cool desert air. No one spoke of what the crates contained. Silence was the labour's only companion. The desert, which only nights before had echoed with unnatural tearing, now carried only the practical sounds of a military convoy preparing to depart. A story that had begun with spectacle was leaving in stillness. The material did not depart in one stream, it fractured deliberately. Some of the loaded boxes were driven toward Roswell's small airstrip and slipped onto night flights bound for Fort Worth. Others were carried northward to train cars that would vanish into schedules stamped with ordinary designations, travelling toward Wright Field in Ohio. Each shipment left with only fragments of the larger whole, divided by plan, drawn out of the desert in sections that resisted any easy reassembly. This was not the disappearance of evidence in a blaze of destruction. It was dispersal through routine. Fragmentation was the tactic. When no one place carried everything, the puzzle ceased to exist in recognizable form. Later, engineers in quiet laboratories found these fragments on their workbenches. To each they arrived under labels stripped of narrative, marked simply as experimental alloy, tagged with classification levels, project codes, but never context. A man in one facility might examine a weightless foil that returned to perfect shape after pressure. At another desk, someone else might handle balsa light beams that cut light at clean angles. None of them knew about the others. The chain of custody ensured each person carried only a fraction of the question, never the whole. Inside those rooms, the study was exacting. Researchers applied tensile tests, stretching the foil between calibrated grips, noting the readout with the precision expected of military contracts. They exposed it to heat, recording recovery properties with language stripped to numbers and graphs. What struck them as unusual was not reported as wonder, but written as anomaly within mechanical limits. Heating curves were plotted with notations like unprecedented scratched in the margins. Metals that bent returned smooth without showing strain, a behaviour that resisted neat categorization. yet the report spoke only of percentages, degrees, recoveries, and elongations. The desert had fallen away, only measurements remained. The way evidence travelled upward through bureaucracy hardened that erasure. Reports were collated and entered into classified channels, bound within the language of technical files. Engineers never saw conclusions from other sites. Results rose like threads pulled into a ceiling of clearance above them, inaccessible from below. Nobody reading an individual report understood where any given fragment had originated. Even base names were omitted. It was data without location, measurement without narrative. Files spoke of Item 14 or Material Group Delta, but not of a field outside Roswell, or of the July night when a metallic scream silenced cicadas. In other crash investigations of the time, every step was documented. Aircraft fragments were matched to serial numbers, manufacturers identified through stamps or etched codes. Diagrams were drawn linking wire to rivet, bolt to fuselage, as investigators traced causes of failure or error. Compared to that procedure, Roswell's chain looked unusual. There were no diagrams pointing to factories in Seattle or Wichita. Photographs were scarce, and those rumoured to exist disappeared swiftly. What remained were isolated anomalies, stripped from context so thoroughly that the very absence became conspicuous. Supporters suggest the process mirrored later systems used to shield revolutionary technology. Stealth aircraft like the early Have Blue program, or spy planes like the U-2, were kept hidden by splitting knowledge across facilities. Workers at one site might see only radar-absorbent coatings, others spent careers handling strange angular panels, unaware that together they formed an aircraft that the public would not see for years. Compartmentalization protected secrets by denying the very existence of a larger whole. It was not drama but procedure, an approach tested and proven long before. Some whisper Roswell's fragments were treated with the same clinical caution, entering the same architecture long before stealth became a word recognizable to civilians. For those tasked with the examinations, the experience carried its cost. A metallurgist alone in a sealed basement might polish a section of a weightless foil against grinding wheels, taking notes he would never be able to share. A material scientist might spend months cycling temperature extremes on a thin beam that never obeyed known expansion patterns, frustrated, fascinated, and yet locked in isolation. With no knowledge of others working on different fragments, each carried the impression they had stumbled upon an isolated anomaly. Some believed they had discovered a breakthrough of their own, unaware that the fragments were siblings divided by secrecy. That loneliness, produced not by accident but by design, etched itself into memory more sharply than any graph line. The deeper the analysis, the more invisible the debris became to history. Reports stacked, seals stamped, microfilms filed in drawers marked under projects few would ever hear spoken aloud. Each step of study buried the material firmer under official routine. A crate arriving with unexplainable metal left no trail of wonder, only a technical file that might be indistinguishable from thousands of others. In the paradox of secrecy, heightened analysis created deeper erasure. The more scientists measured, the less the outside world would ever know those fragments had existed at all. Of course, files end, careers end, and memory sometimes slips past the security oath. Decades later, retired engineers, men who had spent youth in half-lit laboratories, sometimes spoke quietly of that strange stuff from the desert. The words fell softly, never expanded, often followed by regretful silence. Yet they echoed enough to suggest something larger still hummed beneath their recollection. To the record itself, the fragments disappeared into inventory codes, but in human memory, fragile yet stubborn, whispers of impossible alloys refused to fade entirely. And so the chain of custody carried not only boxes but a long shadow. Each crate loaded at dawn under taut canvas was carried away from the desert, but also away from shared history. In its place was a lattice of data stripped of its origin. leaving behind no story for public view. Yet somewhere in those sealed labs and closed test reports, the desert's echo hid in plain sight. Numbers concealing anomalies, files concealing fragments, fragments concealing truth. The desert had been erased from paper, but never fully from human memory, and that faint recall may be the final surviving shard of what was once spread glittering across New Mexico sand. Under the hot glare of floodlights in General Ramey's office, photographers crowded close as scraps of rubber, sticks of balsa, and foil reflectors were laid out for inspection. The debris looked ordinary, scattered pieces that could have come from any meteorological kit. Yet the stage carried a sense of theatre. Reporters bent forward, pencils scratching, eyes pressing for meaning in materials that looked far too mundane to justify the headline screaming flying disc only a day earlier. The scene was carefully arranged. Flat, unremarkable, drained of mystery. For those in the room, it was meant to be convincing. For others, it only deepened doubt. The reality of weather balloons was familiar. Farmers saw them snagged in fences, soldiers trained with their components, school children occasionally caught tattered latex drifting down from the sky. A typical balloon carried little to surprise anyone. Thin neoprene rubber, radar reflectors pieced together from light balsa frames, and silver foil stretched across surfaces to help operators trace its movement. A rancher like Mac Brazel would have recognised such materials instantly. Sticks, rubber, foil. These required no military intelligence officer to interpret. Nothing about them demanded national headlines. And yet such ordinary remnants had been rushed to bases, examined under clearance reserved for nuclear secrets, and guarded before being paraded in General Ramey's office as if mystery had never existed. The explanation, however, carried more weight beneath the surface. In 1947, the US military launched Project Mogul, a classified program designed with Cold War urgency. These high-altitude balloons carried sensitive microphones into the upper atmosphere, listening for the low rumbles of distant nuclear tests. The aim was simple, but urgent. Detect any Soviet atomic detonation long before it appeared in world news. Materials used in this program were not far removed from weather balloons, yet their mission was far more consequential. This secrecy hovered at the same security level later reserved for hydrogen bomb development. The technology existed in plain sight. The reason it existed could not. This closeness, classified project hidden inside a familiar shell, made the cover story practical. Weather balloons, known to many, offered a boring truth that disguised an important one. Ruling authorities understood that if they admitted to a balloon involved in atomic surveillance, questions would escalate into dangerous territory. How far the Soviets had progressed, what detection methods were deployed, what vulnerabilities existed. By presenting the debris as an ordinary meteorological accident, military planners built a wall of plausibility. It was simple, unremarkable. The very dullness of the explanation was its strength. But fragments of doubt lingered where hands had touched the original material. Major Jesse Marcel privately remarked on foil that, folded back smooth no matter how it was bent, beams light as balsa yet unbreakable, markings that seemed embedded rather than painted. Mac Brazel described cattle shying at a debris field as silent as stone, and symbols that glinted under desert sun. Photographs released to the public, showing foil and sticks, looked ordinary. Yet in the minds of those who handled different fragments, memory rebelled against picture. Two truths collided: tactile experience against photographic record. In Roswell, this created more than confusion. It hardened divisions. Locals who had been in the fields, who had lifted fragments, walked past newspaper racks shaking their heads at new headlines. Their own senses would not align with what was printed. The retraction confused those who lacked first-hand experience, but it infuriated those who did. Their quiet certainty built a permanent fault line in memory, one side shaped by official denial, the other by unshakable tactile recall. At fences and in whispers, this division simmered, never fully healing. History offered precedent for such managed doubt. Just years later, U-2 spy plane overflights across Soviet territory would be labelled as weather research. It was a strategy repeated again and again, ordinary imagery masking extraordinary reality. When advanced aircraft broke through ceilings of technology, explanations remained grounded in meteorology or research to keep wandering eyes away. In this way, Roswell fit a pattern not of unique conspiracy, but of bureaucratic habit. To conceal classified projects, officials turned to stories familiar, dull, and easy to accept. Weather, balloons, test flights. Always truths shallow enough to end curiosity. And indeed, much of the public accepted the balloon story. It matched their expectations. The balloon was simple, a tool of meteorology, a harmless accident scattered by desert winds. People did not have to imagine new worlds or vulnerable skies. They could return to ordinary days, to summer crops, to traffic radios crackling in stores. For the majority, this was enough. The newspaper corrections smoothed the strangeness back into routine, and the nation settled. Boredom had done its intended work. Yet in corridors of Roswell diners and pastures at dusk, a haunting split played on. Witnesses who refused to reconcile their senses with photographs became storytellers. Some described smooth metals, others strange patterns, always contradicting the sticks and foil now catalogued. For them, the denial itself became part of the mystery. The greater the official pressure to accept balloons, the deeper their certainty grew that something larger had been concealed. Skeptics leaned on the Air Force's later reports, noting how materials consistent with balloon construction had been identified. Believers answered with stubborn tactile memory, hands holding fragments heavier in implication than official words allowed. The pattern here extends beyond one ranch in New Mexico. It represents how societies handle contradictions between lived experience and sanctioned explanation. Weather balloons versus memory metals, photographs versus sensation. Both stories exist in parallel, never overlapping. Officials called the matter settled. In homes, in fields, in midnight conversations, it stayed unsettled. As decades wore on, the two narratives hardened. On one side, classified documents, later reports, photographs of sticks and foil. On the other, recollections of unyielding beams and symbols etched like language itself. Plausibility satisfied institutions, mystery satisfied no one. And in that divide, Roswell did not fade. It thickened into enduring lore, a tale shaped as much by official half-truths as by whispered insistence. The ordinary scraps on Ramey's floor continue to echo, not because of what they were, but because of what they replaced, an earlier set of fragments that some hands swore carried something beyond Earth. That replacement created the paradox, a cover story that succeeded on paper but failed in lived memory. Two truths, two worlds, both ordinary, both extraordinary, colliding in one desert town. And as the years stretched onward, the focus shifted again, toward those who carried private knowledge under public silence. The story did not rest on what the debris was, but on what people were told to believe it had been. And in that quiet tension, the real burden began to grow. Jesse Marcel Jr. sat with age carved into every line of his face, his voice carrying the uneven rhythm of memory rather than certainty. With his hands, now weathered and trembling, he traced the air as if still holding the fragment his father had once placed before him. He described it not as metal in any ordinary sense, but as something that felt startlingly light while refusing to bend or break. Time had blurred the exact shape, but not the sensation. It had imprinted itself like a scar that memory could not wash away, and he carried it through the decades as testimony he could never release. For him, memory became its own artifact. Authorities could burn photographs, misfile records, or vanish boxes into locked depots. but no one could erase the flash of awe between father and son in that dimly lit room. The event didn't remain bound only to metal. It fused into memory itself where classification stamps could not reach. Some whisper that this makes recollection the only true evidence left of Roswell. The fragments might have been hidden in hangars, but the emotions stayed welded to human experience. Yet witness accounts soften on their edges as the years slip by. Details stretch and bend, measurements become hazy, while the deeper impressions, terror, wonder, confusion, stay sharp. Marcel Jr. could no longer say precisely how wide the beam had been, but he remembered how his father's hand trembled when he set it on the table. He remembered how the surface patterns glimmered faintly purple, so unusual that even a child sensed they carried meaning. The core emotions survived longer than exact figures, and it was those emotions that gave his account its enduring weight. At street level, the pressure to stay quiet worked itself into daily life. In Roswell diners, neighbours who once pressed forward eagerly to hear about discs or strange beams began to fall silent when the subject returned. Over time, even curiosity grew hesitant. Families whispered warnings to children not to mention what Grandpa talked about, while laughter at the wrong moment could mark a storyteller as untrustworthy. Ridicule became the harsher weapon, often sharper than direct threats. No soldier needed to walk through town to enforce silence. The community did much of it on its own. Psychology offers one reason why witnesses clung so tightly to their versions. Neuroscience shows that emotional encounters, especially those stitched with fear or awe, become anchored more firmly than ordinary memory. Stress hormones carve these scenes into place, lodging them where time cannot easily fade them. Researchers have long noted how trauma and wonder both deepen grooves in recall, creating accounts that resist the erosion of decades. This helps explain why even as Marcel Jr.'s memories of exact dimensions frayed, his insistence on the strangeness of the material never wavered. The feeling of impossibility remained vivid. For Major Marcel himself, the split was sharper. His service demanded loyalty to a narrative he knew to be incomplete. Military order required silence, while fatherhood compelled some trace of honesty. By showing a small piece to his son, an act both reckless and tender, he shared not only a mystery but also the weight of secrecy that followed him for life. This was the paradox he carried: truth spoken in whispers at home, silenced in official reports at the office. Silence became its own duty, even as the contradiction pressed against his ribs like a lodged stone. The town seemed to absorb this culture of shadows in its daily rhythms. Streets still bustled, ranches still worked, but conversations developed gaps, moments where words faltered and topics shifted with unnatural speed. Children asked about discs only to be hushed quickly. Neighbours nodded politely but avoided dwelling on those memories, as though certain corners of community life lay under quarantine. The atmosphere gained a faint tilt, a half-seen pressure that made itself felt more in absence than presence. For Marcel, the contradiction grew most clear in his solitude. Seated late at night, lamp turned low, he often replayed the first hours of contact in his mind. He pictured his gloves brushing the debris, hearing a strange hum without source, sensing the weightless strength in his palm. Yet official reports bore none of this. They framed what he had seen in simpler words, as if the language itself was enlisted to erase reality. Living between those two versions gradually etched a toll on body and spirit alike, and yet the attempt to strip memory of its sharpness had a reverse effect. The more the story was edited by official tongues, the more sacred the untouched memory became to those who lived it. Witnesses, pushed into silence, learned to guard their recollections tighter. Over decades, those personal fragments turned into the last unbroken vault of evidence, one that no command chain could confiscate. In this way, memory survived where photographs failed, where files evaporated, where crates were lost to shadows. By the time Marcel Jr. spoke in later life, his voice was aware of its role not just as personal memory, but as cultural inheritance. What had once been a private burden edged closer toward becoming collective law, moving from family recollection into the broader imagination. The story was ready to outlive secrecy, to carry its unresolved echo from one household into the shared mythology of humanity. And so, the private truth of a ranch house evening whispered between father and son stretched outward into the long corridor of history where it waits still, unresolved, urging ears to listen. And here lies the paradox. A single summer night in 1947 planted its seed in secrecy, yet the seed sprouted larger in imagination than any official narrative could contain. The crash site itself may have long returned to grass and fences, but in stories it grows without boundary, rooted not in New Mexico soil, but in collective wonder. The more ordinary the official explanation sounds, the stronger the myth builds its own architecture. And that myth, shaped by generations, now rises like an echo larger than the desert itself, carrying its weight across cultures, across decades, and perhaps into futures we have not yet learned to imagine. The screen glows green in the dark, a radar sweep circling in endless rhythm. Phosphor dots appear for a moment, hang briefly, then fade into nothing. Some dots belong to planes with flight plans traced in neat lines. Others arrive without explanation, hanging too still or moving too fast, before slipping into digital memory banks that stretch across global servers in 2024. The technology is sharper now, more precise than anything the Roswell officers could have imagined, yet the same question lingers. What are we actually seeing? And why does the record so often dissolve just when it matters most? We walk today under the lens of thousands of satellites, each capable of watching a square of Earth finer than a playing card. Phones in pockets can record in high definition at the press of a thumb. Drones streak across skies, and congressional hearings stream worldwide in real time. Yet despite this machinery of vision, the mystery refuses to vanish. Reports of unknown craft still surface from military pilots. They describe objects accelerating without visible propulsion, glowing spheres playing shadow games above training ranges. Yet again and again, their testimonies fall into folders labelled classified, leaving the public with echoes instead of the evidence. This is the paradox. An age of radical visibility, paired with habits of concealment built long ago. In 1947, the secrecy was managed with locked cabinets and rubber stamps. Now it is shaped by digital silos, secure networks, and black servers humming in temperature-controlled vaults. The storage method changed, but the instinct of silence did not. Supporters suggest this isn't conspiracy so much as inertia, the Cold War's organisational rules echoing into decades that no longer resemble the world for which they were first drawn. Files disappear today not simply because they are dangerous, but because the system itself was built to lock rather than open. When files do surface, their arrival feels more like theatre than illumination. Periodic declassifications appear in thick stacks, struck through with black bars that replace whole paragraphs and sometimes entire pages. What leaks forward is technical, dry, and stripped of meaning. A sentence trails off into ink, leaving behind a puzzle where absence carries more weight than the words allowed to survive. Entire groups of enthusiasts pore over these documents late into night hours, searching the redactions for pattern, reading a mission as language. It recalls the past, when meteorological balloons were laid across floors to divert attention from stranger fragments. Public response has also shifted since Roswell. In 1947, whispers of flying discs lit both wonder and fear. Adults scanned skies nervously, wondering what it meant for cities already tense after the war. Today, surveys suggest a different mood. Even if confirmation of extraterrestrial craft fell across evening news cycles, many would scroll past with a shrug, perhaps with a tweet, before moving on. The cultural temperature lowered from panic to jaded acceptance. Decades of television dramas, comic illustrations, and conspiracy hashtags have drained novelty from the idea. The mystery lingers, but the fear has softened into fatigue. This shift, however, hasn't spared the pilots. Their livelihoods rest on precise reporting, and mistaken observation can end in tragedy. Yet some aviators testifying recently spoke of filing reports that promptly vanished into bureaucratic channels. Career officers described encounters that scrambled sensors or outpaced fighters, then watched their accounts disappear as if they had never been spoken. Their professionalism, essential to national defence, becomes awkward evidence once it crosses the line into mystery. Records drown not in disbelief, but in systemic habit, acknowledged in brief, then sealed under classification headings. The human cost lies in the dismissal of expertise. Classification systems carry their own momentum. Originally shaped to protect atomic research and Cold War surveillance, they learned to treat all anomaly as potential advantage or threat. Once placed into these frameworks, files rarely escape. Entire offices exist to extend the lock, not to revisit whether secrecy still serves. Documents about craft that defy known flight may not remain hidden because of what they show, but because unsealing them would require dismantling procedures built to endure by design. In this sense, the mystery grows not out of the craft themselves, but out of the institutions that handle them. From the outside, this creates what some call informed helplessness. Citizens now know the rhythm of cover-ups. They know to expect black bars on pages, sudden contradictions in press statements, and official stories that change overnight. Yet this knowledge does not empower. Instead, it paralyzes. An abundance of information that reveals less creates exhaustion. People live with constant suspicion, but without clear paths to resolution. What some whisper is the saddest trick of secrecy is that it no longer hides content, only convinces people that content is unknowable. In such a climate, mistrust spreads like dust carried across desert miles. True disclosure, if it ever arrived, would demand far more than releasing files. It would need institutions willing to turn their channels inside out, to adopt habits of openness after 70 years of the opposite. Scientists would have to test and agree publicly on standards. Governments would have to restore trust drained by decades of manipulation. And people themselves would need to treat the subject with steadiness rather than spectacle. Anything less simply extends the cycle, producing reports that say too little, hearings that answer less, redactions that fuel more hunger. The real challenge lies not in proof, but in transformation of habit. In the end, the story stays bound not within servers or manila folders, but in the hands of those who experienced it directly. Mac Brazel stooping to gather impossible metal, Jesse Marcel tracing symbols under a lamplight, pilots staring wide-eyed at radar echoes that defied physics. These human anchors keep the story alive more strongly than our electronic archives ever could. Whether the evidence sleeps under redactions or locked behind biometric security doors, memory continues outside, held in voices, gestures, and accounts passed to family. The digital age may classify faster, wider, deeper, but the heart of the question still waits in touch, in story, and in the quiet between words. And so today, as phosphor dots ripple across screens in command centres, and as fresh reports find their way into encrypted channels, the echo of Roswell threads through. The form changes. Grainy photographs replaced by cockpit footage, typewritten reports exchanged for congressional video streams. But the rhythm feels familiar. Technology expanded clarity, yet secrecy keeps pace. One begins to wonder whether the answer has remained the same all along, that the greatest challenge is less about identifying what flies above us and more about facing what our own systems choose to bury beneath. Roswell endures not for the debris itself, but for what followed. The vanishing reports, the redacted files, the locked drawers. The silence that wrapped around those events became louder than any official statement, shaping memory into something heavier than fact. It now stands as a symbol of how secrecy meets imagination, how governments protect shadows while people gaze upward with questions. The desert may have swallowed fragments, but the story still lingers. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and which theory draws you most. Not to solve, but to keep wondering together.